Andrew Shepherd. I'm Director of the Chronic Poverty Advisory Network. I'm based at the Overseas Development Institute in London. There are three things you need to do if you want to eradicate extreme poverty. One is to tackle chronic poverty. This is to support people who are in long-term poverty over many years or their whole lives, who pass poverty on to their children. So these are, in a way, among the poorest people. You need to stop people falling into poverty because in many cases, people may not be poor, but they are vulnerable, and with different events, maybe conflict or environmental hazards or ill health, very often ill health, and death of key members of a family, a whole family can go into poverty. So you need to stop impoverishment. And thirdly, you need to help people you need to have policies, you need to have a good enabling environment to assist people once they have escaped extreme poverty, to continue escaping, to continue in a positive direction. So these three things then require maybe 13, 14 sets of policies. There are three particular policies which work for all three agendas. One is social protection. Another one is a massive investment in education, especially pre-primary and post-primary. The emphasis so far has been very much on primary education. So social protection, education, and then a bundle of measures which we have called in the report pro-poorest growth. So this is measures which can help to include the poorest people in economic growth, but on good terms, not on adverse terms. Often the poorest people are included with very low wages, with very poor conditions of work, and so on, but they need better than that if they're going to escape their poverty. So one of the big debates is around economic growth. And some people believe that all you need is economic growth. I don't think that's quite good enough. We need to look at policies, and we need to adjust policies with a poverty lens. We need to ask which policies are going to support economic growth. Yes, it's necessary, but which will include the poorest people on these better terms. Now, these are macroeconomic policies, labor market policies, and key sectoral policies, for example, agriculture, energy, financial services, education, as I've already mentioned. With education, also linking the school system with the labor market and enabling good transitions to be made from the school system into the labor market. So the heavy lifting here for this pro-poorest type of growth is going to be by supporting labor-intensive sectors, so the jobs are there, but also working to make sure that those jobs are better jobs, that they are not bad jobs, that they have improving wages, that they have improving conditions of work. So, for example, packages of policies to do with minimum wages and supporting social protection measures can be really important. Because many of the poorest people are in rural areas and work in agriculture, really good agricultural policies supporting smallholder farmers are absolutely essential. And this is one of the reasons why, for example, a region like Southeast Asia and some of the East Asian countries have done so well in terms of poverty reduction, is that those policies have been in place. Many of the poorest people make their living in the informal sector, in the informal economy, and they have informal jobs or they are self-employed. Improving their conditions is really tricky and politically challenging. What you need to do is to encourage the formalization of enterprises over time without damaging people's job prospects. You have to register informal enterprises, you have to regulate informal jobs, again without damaging job prospects. And you need to extend the protection that the state provides to people working in the informal economy. So this brings politics into the picture, and really key to getting the range of good policies which I have identified to support the poorest people. Politics is absolutely critical. Now, there's a big politics here, a politics of political movements which bring the interests of the poorest people into the formal political process. So the poorest people become represented. And this is often through a combination of a political movement which gets into power, through constitutional reforms that they might introduce, through affirmative actions which give some special privileges and advantages to people who are otherwise highly disadvantaged or discriminated against, and universal actions of various kinds, universal access to health, universal access to education, universal access to social protection. These are some of the key things that these progressive governments have been able to do. Now, there are these radical regimes which have introduced a whole set of progressive approaches to policy. But what about the possibilities in countries where such progressive regimes are not there? Where maybe more piecemeal measures are needed. What are the prospects for inclusive development? And then we can think here about the kind of governance reforms which many countries have undertaken during the last 15, 20 years. These have focused on achieving public goods that everybody wants, but which typically remain out of reach of many people. But the governance reforms have not quite gone the right way. They have focused on improving the response of people providing the reforms to those demanding the reforms. So there's this sort of supply and demand logic about the reforms, which hasn't quite worked. And there's good evidence now coming from a range of countries, particularly in Africa, that what you need to do is to find ways of creating consensus, building trust, finding locally relevant solutions, and adjusting traditional or cultural approaches to solving problems, in particular issues or sectors. You also need to improve the coherence of policy regimes in a sector or subsector. So, for example, if you want to improve access to health services, you might abolish fees for attending health services. But if you don't, at the same time, increase the budget for the health service, you will just create a huge demand which cannot be met. So it's important that any sectoral policy, like in this case a health policy, has a good internal coherence. Then there are two things which are really needed in these situations. One is a national leadership which provides some kind of motivation and disciplining of actors. So if actors perform their jobs reasonably well, then they get some kind of recognition, some kind of reward. And also, it needs to be a policy regime which allows local actors at local level, subnational level, local government, civil society organizations, to formulate relevant responses to solve problems in a locally relevant way. So if you have that kind of enabling environment, and Rwanda is a country which exemplifies both of those, both the national leadership and the discipline, and the good subnational enabling environment, you're likely to be able to make progress. Now, from what I've been saying, it's fairly obvious that there are no magic bullets in eradicating poverty. I think there are two proposals for magic bullets, however, and we need to spend a bit of time thinking about those. One is financial inclusion, and microfinance, I think particularly in the 1990s, was seen as a magic bullet, and there was a huge investment in microfinance, expecting that it would bring millions of people out of poverty. And yes, I mean, it has performed to some extent, but it has been disappointing. The result has been disappointing, and many of the poorest people have not benefited from microfinance or financial services more generally. So now there is a rethinking of financial services going on. If you want to include the poorest people in financial services, you need to focus on savings rather than credit, for example. The focus in the 1990s was on credit. You need to try and link informal savings groups, often women's groups, with formal financial services, so that well-performing savings groups can actually benefit from formal financial services. You need to try and link social protection programs with financial services, so that once people have got a bit of a leg up through a social protection program, they can then begin to participate in the growth economy. You need to also focus very much on the insurance side of financial services because, as I mentioned earlier, many people are becoming poor and they need insurance. So these four things would enable financial services to be much more effective as a mechanism for including the poorest people in economic growth. If you take social protection, we know that social transfers can bring the poorest people up towards a more reasonable standard of living. They can both bring them up and they can bring them in. If the poorest people are excluded from political participation, from national development of various sorts, social protection will help to bring them in, to help to include them. In the coming years, we also need to think about the role of social protection in relation to preventing impoverishment. And this is a little bit of a wider agenda, but it's an agenda that many developing countries are going to have to come to. Now, for all this, there's a couple of infrastructure issues which we need to discuss. One is the need for better data, because in many countries there is not very good data about poverty issues, and the data that there is may be out of date. So there's a need for much more real-time data and accurate data. We need to be able to disaggregate by gender. We need to be able to disaggregate by social groups, particularly social groups experiencing these multiple disadvantages. So we need to be able to disaggregate among people who are poor or nearly poor, vulnerable, and so on. We need to have data on different dimensions of deprivation. And crucially, we need to have data, good data, over time. So household surveys, as many as possible, need to track households and individuals over time so that we can see the dynamics of improving welfare or regressing welfare if people are getting poorer. We can begin to understand why this is happening with this better data which tracks individuals and households over time. There's a big debate out there also about poverty measures. How do you measure poverty? And there are two basic ways. One is thinking about income or consumption, and the other one is taking a range of different dimensions of deprivation, usually including consumption or income, but it could be also focusing on education and health, and access to water, and access to transport, and so on and so forth, access to energy. And you compile a multidimensional index of deprivation. So there are these two broad approaches. There are then very complex ways, when you are thinking of the income and consumption measures, there are very complex ways that the World Bank in particular translates local monetary values from different countries into a comparable set of values across the world. This is a very complex and technical debate, and it's a debate which is not very well governed. At the moment, we have the World Bank, which is setting the monetary poverty measures. We have the UN, United Nations Development Programme, which is setting the multidimensional poverty measures. And nobody is really governing this process. So both organizations are kind of free to set the measures that they want to set. There's no process of agreement and wider intergovernmental agreement and governance of this process. So I think that's probably where I will leave you at the moment. It may be that you can look at these readings and come up with ideas of your own on how progress can be achieved over the next 15 to 20 years. Thank you very much.